Hello and welcome to a conversation about the paralysis that is threatening lives of more than 3 million people crammed in northern Syria, and a humanitarian disaster that is unfolding due to Russia's threat to block cross-border aid to Idlib in the UN Security Council. Russia is insisting that all aid should go through Damascus, through the hands of the Syrian regime, in a situation where the UN itself and others have clearly established that the Syrian regime has arbitrarily prevented aid from reaching any areas under the control of the opposition. However, this conversation is solely focused on the UN security approval of the cross-border aid, the resolution 2156, when in fact many international scholars, including Toby Kádmán, who we will speak to today, believe that UN has alternatives, that there is legal basis for this aid to be delivered legally without the UN Security Council approval. Some 35 leading international law experts have signed a letter to this effect in 2014 when Resolution 2156 was passed. And the same issues remain today, maybe with more gravity. Toby Kádmán is co-founder of the Guernica Group and head of Guernica 37 International Justice Chambers in London. He's an established international law specialist, and his particular area of expertise is international legal obligations and the UN system of protection. Toby, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. My pleasure.
You are one of the 35 signatories of the 2014 letter by eminent international law scholars, who then clearly established the basis that the UN had, the legal basis for delivery of cross-border aid without the UN Security Council approval. We will discuss the details of that, but it is interesting to mention in the introduction that the letter was signed not only by, let me use the word, giants of international law, such as Professor William Schabas and Richard Goldstone and others, not to do injustice to others' names, but also Hans Corell, the former long-serving head of the UN Office of Legal Affairs, which is the usual source of legal opinion acted upon the UN agencies in similar situations. And we will get to the role of the Office of Legal Affairs in this issue. But let me first ask you bluntly, is the UN Security Council approval absolutely required for the cross-border aid to Idlib to be legally delivered?
Well, Rafik, I mean, first of all, thanks for giving me an opportunity to answer this. And in response to your blunt question, let me give a very blunt answer. As we said in 2014, the UN Security Council is not required for a number of different reasons that were set out in our joint letter. So absolutely no, blunt answer to a blunt question, it is not required.
Can you, in fact, walk us through the three reasons that you have identified as the main basis why the UN can deliver aid to Idlib without UN Security Council approval?
Yeah, and what I would say is, I mean, you've already said that there were sort of giants of international law, and I consider myself to be a minnow amongst those giants. And it was, it was a privilege to be asked to contribute to that opinion and put my name against such people as you've already mentioned, who are highly experienced international jurists in this particular field. And the three principal grounds that were relied upon, of course there are more than three, but the three principal grounds that were relied upon are fairly clear in international law as far as I'm concerned. So the first one was that there is a condition for meeting legitimate humanitarian action. And of course, this requires principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and non-discrimination in delivering aid. I mean, these are not unknown principles of international law. These are fairly clear, recognized for many, many decades principles of international humanitarian law. And so that was a very easy point to set out as the first primary ground for not being required to comply, or not being required to have the UN Security Council consent. The second ground, which is all about control of territory. And so when the letter was sent in 2014, it was very clear that there were areas where aid was going to be delivered that were not under the control of the Syrian regime under Bashar al-Assad. I mean, these were areas that were under the effective control of various opposition groups, such as the Free Syrian Army. And so areas such as Aleppo, or certainly part of Aleppo and Idlib, were, as they were not under the control of the Syrian regime, there was no requirement to seek the permission of the Syrian regime, because it's a question of effective control. And then the third ground, again, a fairly clear established principle of international law, is that humanitarian access in a state of conflict, when you are providing absolutely necessary critical aid to civilians in a conflict, is that can only be obstructed, refused, or frustrated according to very, very clear grounds, such as military necessity. So if there is a question of those civilians needing to be protected as a result of conflict in that particular territory, then humanitarian access can be prevented for a period of time. Again, it can't be it cannot be prevented indefinitely. I mean, it is a temporary block of aid, but there are grounds under general principles of international humanitarian law where that can be prevented. But in the circumstances that we were considering in 2014, there were no grounds to justify that refusal. And so, looking at these three very clear principles, recognized principles of international humanitarian law, there was no basis to prevent the humanitarian access from being carried out, and in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution.
Would you say, for the sake of the conversation, we need to recognize the reality in which the UN agencies, which have recently released a statement where they are imploring the UN Security Council for approval, that the reasons here are more of a political nature, and in fact an attempt to not upset the Syrian regime and Russia too much, so as to allow the UN agencies to operate in the regime-controlled areas, rather than legal as it is portrayed?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's entirely correct, that the opposition to this has been entirely political, and there is no proper legal basis for maintaining that position. And of course, as you said, you have to look at the practical realities of the conflict itself. So I think that is very, very clearly the situation, is that we are not, we're looking at the political situation on the ground, plus we're looking at the practical reality of being able to provide aid safely in a secure environment. And as you've sort of alluded to, what we're looking at, possibly not in 2014, which was a very different situation to what we're looking at now, but certainly what we're looking at now is almost, certainly with the number of states, there is attempts to re-establish diplomatic ties. There, obviously, everybody wants to bring an end to a decade conflict in which 500,000 people have been killed. So, and as we know, half the pre-war population have been forced out of their homes, either internally or externally displaced. So I think that there is this very clear desire to try and find a political solution. But the continual reliance on legal barriers that do not actually exist in reality, it remains to be deeply disturbing. But it is very much a question of the political reality on the ground and the reality of the situation. I mean, what we've seen, not just in respect of international humanitarian assistance, but general application of international law, whether we're talking about justice and accountability or humanitarian assistance, there has been this complete blockage or impotence of the UN to effect any real change, particularly in the Security Council, where Russia continues to block any to a meaningful, and that has been a constant barrier to affecting any change in the Syrian conflict. I mean, there are many ways that we can look at what Russia has opposed over the years, but we're now even seeing that Russia is opposing and seemingly will continue to oppose any form of humanitarian assistance, and that is deeply disturbing. I think one of the things that we need to really think about is the intent of the Syrian regime. And we've heard statements from various different members of the government where I think it was to quote Jamil Hassan, a senior member of the regime, where he said he would rather have 2 million people serving at their knees than 20 million opposing him. So you can see that there is this intent on the part of the Syrian regime to wipe out any form of opposition, and the UN has been effectively hamstrung in bringing any real change there.
Absolutely. I think that very often conversations on issues of this nature are completely decontextualized in a way that they are displaced to a legal field without recognizing the reality that you are talking about here. But keeping it on this legal field, because it is important to deconstruct this idea that the UN Security Council's approval is the only source of legality for cross-border aid. I would just refer to something that is quite a disturbing fact, and that is that it seems that the Office of the Legal Affairs of the UN and the legal opinion on this is serving as the basis for the Emergency Relief Coordinator and Interagency Standing Committee and the UN agencies in their insistence that the Security Council approval is required. Yet this legal opinion is not public. We have no ability to, in fact, debate and test this legal opinion in the way that it requires to be tested. Precisely for this reason, and this is the reason that I mentioned that the signatory, one of the signatories of the letter from 2014 was Hans Corell, long-serving head of the Office of Legal Affairs, which is in direct conflict with the supposed legal opinion, which no one has seen. How would you comment on this lack of transparency?
Well, look, I mean, I think it is very disturbing that this opinion is not made public, and as you quite rightly say, I mean, having Hans Corell as a signatory on this letter that says that the UN Security Council resolution is not required is significant because of his role with the Office of Legal Affairs in the past. But I think it is highly problematic that if the UN is relying on a position in a legal opinion by the Office of Legal Affairs that is not made public, that lack of transparency deeply affects the legitimacy of the UN action or the UN inaction. And so certainly myself and other international jurists who've been involved in this process have criticized the UN in the past for not being more transparent in its decision-making process. And so, you know, if there can be any credibility or any legitimacy in the position that the UN has taken, I see no reason why that legal opinion should not be made public. If that legal opinion even exists as a legal opinion, and I think there has been some question as to whether there is actually a legal opinion. I mean, one would hope that the UN would not rely on a position that that doesn't exist in reality. And I wouldn't like to make such an accusation that it doesn't exist, but there has been concerns raised that the sort of the opaque position that has been taken fundamentally undermines the significance of what is being discussed. And so I would certainly say that if that is the position of the OA, and that I see no reason why that should not be made public, then they should make that public now. As you said, this is a process we were looking at in 2014, and we're looking at 7 years later, where the situation is demonstrably worse than it was in 2014, with no real end in sight. The humanitarian crisis, as what we're looking at now, when we approach another winter in Syria, which is devastating to the civilian community, particularly in areas like Aleppo and Idlib. I mean, that really does need to be made public, because if we are failing the Syrian people, there has to be justification for that.
Last question, Toby. Like you mentioned, the letter that we are discussing today and the points made in that letter was written in 2014. We are seeing different campaigns that are appealing to the humanitarian instincts of Russia and warning of the consequences if the resolution 2156 is not extended. And we have all seen what the humanitarian instincts of Russia are over the last several years in Syria. What more can we do? Where can we go? How can we request, for instance, states that do have an interest in seeing this paralysis ended and the chokehold, Russian chokehold on Idlib aid ended? How can we address them to, for instance, seek for the OLA's legal opinion to be made public? What are the directions that this advocacy can take today, 2021?
Well, I think, first of all, I would say if I had an answer to that, I think I'd probably be able to solve many of the problems in Syria. So I don't have a quick and easy response to that. But what I would say is that the UN and the OLA in particular doesn't operate in a vacuum. I mean, they are responsible to the states that form its membership. And I think if a significant number of states request for that process to be transparent, then the Office of Legal Affairs is going to have to respond to that. I think that a lot more can and should be done. One of the difficulties with looking at an area such as this is that you have now conflicts all over the world, and the attention span of the international community, as we both know, is generally fairly short-lived. And we quickly move on to Myanmar, to Yemen, to Libya, and elsewhere. And so I think what we have to understand is that we cannot move the focus away from Syria. This is the worst humanitarian crisis that we have seen in a generation, and it continues to be as such, and we cannot afford to take our attention away from that. And any process of political stability that is reached has to look at the humanitarian crisis, and it has to look at the justice and accountability side. And I don't think you can separate the two. The fact that there has been this refusal to engage on ensuring humanitarian assistance to civilians is very closely connected to the whole question of justice and accountability. And I think, as we know from having spent years looking at these issues in the Balkans, we know what a lack of appropriate attention to those issues will create for the long-term stability of a country. And we have to understand, if we don't do something about this now, the Syrian crisis is not a decade long. We're talking about 40 years. This has been brewing for all during that time. And if we don't pay attention to that now, the rest of the world and the Western world is going to pay the consequence for that, with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more refugees fleeing Syria for their lives. And so we have to take that seriously. So states have to campaign, they have to lobby the UN, they have to ensure that this process is recognise that there is no legal obstacle to the provision of humanitarian assistance, and they have to demand that it's done. They have to put pressure on the likes of Turkey and Jordan that have an ability to affect that aid cross borders, and they have to appeal to the membership of the United Nations that this is a humanitarian crisis that affects us all. We can't just close our eyes to it.
With those words, Toby, Kádmán, thank you very much for this conversation. We sincerely hope that it will help move it in the right direction and contribute to ending this paralysis. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.